Okay, I think we're making a start. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to have you with us for this first session of Critical Conversations. My name is Richard Hill. I'm a co-founder of Critical Conversations, which is a small organization which has taken it up upon itself to try and engage with public conversation around contemporary issues, particularly issues of truth, reason, and freedom and justice. Before I go on, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this unceded land, and to pay my respects also to elders past, present, and future. Okay, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for being here. And I'm particularly honoured and pleased to have with us Mandy Nolan, who's a local comedian, or I should say national, internationally renowned comedian, activist, writer, journalist, and a very courageous, outspoken person in our local community of Mullumbimby in New South Wales. And a particular thanks also to Julian Baggini, one of England's most prominent philosophers, who's taken time out to speak today. And I'm really delighted by that, because I've been aware of Julian's work for a number of years and quoted it fairly extensively in my own work. So thank you so much, Julian, for being here. Terrific. I suppose the question arises as to why found an organization called Critical Conversations, what prompted us to do it. I think, like many other people, both in Australia and around the world, we're becoming increasingly aware of deepening political polarization, a growing distrust of democratic institutions and democratic elites, and of the exercise of power more generally. And we're also aware of the sense of powerlessness that people feel in the wake, particularly of corporate power, and the disconnection that has scarred our society and riven people apart from each other. There has been, I think it's safe to say, a retreat into echo chambers and the assertion more recently of fake news and alternative facts, all of which has led us towards cynicism and further distrust, and ultimately led to the events of January the 6th earlier this year. I think, as Julian says in this splendid book, A Short History of Truth, that what we're confronting is not so much post-truth as post-complexity. That now we're seeing the boiling down of complex arguments and positions into very simple, reactive, knee-jerk positions very often. And people are engaging with each other, often in very uncivil and unkind ways. I think what we're trying to achieve in establishing Critical Conversations are a number of things. But for this particular event, with its focus on truth, I think what we're trying to do is discover or rediscover what Julian in his book refers to as epistemological virtues. That is modesty, openness, a sense of collective inquiry, and respect for credible expertise and those things called facts. It's also a call and a cry for respectful dialogue and exploration of contemporary ideas, rather than the hostility and incivility that we're now experiencing across the world and in Australia too. So look, I welcome Mandy, I welcome Julian. I'm very pleased to have you both here, two very important voices on a very important topic. Before I go, just to give you the heads up in terms of what's coming in terms of future talks. In October, we will have Timothy Eric Strom, who's a prominent independent journalist and academic who resides in Melbourne, who's written, I think, one of the most illuminating essays I've read about how we might begin to traverse the complexities of ideas that currently confront us. He's also author of a book called Globalization and Surveillance. And Tim will be talking about the sense of reason. What does actually reason mean in the current environment? Can we rehearse the idea of reason as a mechanism for making sense of all the information overload with which we're confronted. And in November, we have Sarah Joseph, Professor Sarah Joseph, who is Professor of Human Rights at Griffith University. And she, along with Simon Longstaff, hopefully, the director of the Ethics Centre in Melbourne, will be talking about the notion of freedom, surely one of the most overused and misused terms in the current era. Before I go, I'd just like to say a sincere thanks to all those people who've enabled this event to happen this evening, to Jenny, Catherine, to Dale Emerson, to Shona Anderson, to Michael Bolson, to Art Burrows, and to Amy, our amazing technician who's working on this event as we speak. Thank you to you all for all your considerable contribution. I will now pass you over to Mandy Nolan, who will MC the event tonight.
Hey, thanks, Richard. Thanks so much for that. And hello to all of you sitting out there in virtual land. It's great to be here. Well, it's great to be here. I've been here the whole time. It's weird how you actually come into a default saying it's great to be here, and I'm actually at home. And you're at home too. Here we are in our virtual world. It's certainly changed things, and change is a great instigator, isn't it, of reactionary thinking, and that's why we're here tonight talking about truth. Richard started with an acknowledgement of country, and it is. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are here on the land of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. But isn't it ironic that we're here talking about truth and about this current place we find ourselves in right now? But we're in a country, you know, where the whole country is in fact founded on a lie. Our sense of fabricating and believing handy little stories seems to be almost deeply imbued into the mythology of who we are as white Australians. That occurred to me as Richard was speaking, and I went, wow, colonisation is very much falls into one of those, you know, neat little, you know, truth buckets. I don't think that's actually a philosophical word, but I'm going to call it that. Colonisation, I've often thought, and I should let you know, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a comedian and an obtuse thinker. I've often thought colonisation is actually mispronounced and should be colonisation, with pronouncing the colon really strongly. And it basically means when a whole lot of assholes turn up and steal your land. Apologies to Julian as a Brit coming through. I'm sure he'll appreciate that. So tonight we're digging deep on truth, which is the other great irony was, if it's published, it must be the truth, which is ironic because this whole critical conversation, the wrong link was published. There was a mistake in the booking link. So that made people very frustrated because if it was in the paper, it had to be right. So it wasn't working. So you had to use critical thinking just to log on to get here. So congratulations. If you made it to the critical conversations tonight, you are a critical thinker. Because you made it through. If you didn't, there are people still out there trying to log on through the wrong website. That wasn't a mistake. That was a test. And we're glad that you made it. That often happens. I often talk about, I'm a little bit of a Google. I have Google alerts set for everything, for all my interest. Oh, Richard's come back. Hello. It's all right, he just popped in. He was playing with the buttons. But, you know, I have lots and lots of Google alerts set, and I always have that thing where the default with truth is, isn't it? Because I always say, this is how I do my research now. I have a bit of a Google. I find stuff that confirms my belief bias, and if it doesn't, I just delete it. That's how we operate. And so a lot of people operate. I guess we just want to confirm our bias. I'm sort of really doing a lot of thinking on this. We've sort of, you know, it was a trillion years ago since I was at university. And I do remember, you know, the many, many semesters I had to spend reading Jacques Derrida, you know, writing his text on deconstruction. You know, if you wanted to kill, you know, any interest in you at a party, just talking about deconstruction and, you know, the death of the author was enough to kill. It was the death of you. It took me so long to understand this whole idea that there could be a multiplicity of truths, because I've been brought up as a good Catholic girl where I believed in the absolute truth. There was one God, one Almighty, that religious indoctrination, this whole idea that there could be a multiplicity of truths made by, of course, our own personal perceptions. It didn't really kind of account for the way fact and the way, evidence, research might impact, but it was really accounting for what our experiences were and how some of us who had more access tended to marginalise the truths of others and sort of leave them on the perimeters, or the margins, as I guess it was called. So I sort of kind of got my head around that. And if I was to understand it through an experience that I had as a child, I do remember first reading, and this comes down to, because what's happening right now, because we're living in this very uncertain time, which I am sure Julian will dig down into more deeply, but this uncertain time where many of us don't know how to, we're so out of practice, we're not match fit for the kind of researching that we need to be doing at the moment. This is hardcore thinking. We have come out of a very flabby time of not having to do much thinking, and suddenly we're having to do it. We're having to make very critical decisions. We're having to really look at what's placed before us. And sometimes we have to, join, sort of have ideas and actually lose friends whose thinking may not align with ours. Here's an example of what I believe is truth. And this is how I got to understand Derrida. When I was a child, I believed in a thing. I remember I was 4. I learned to read quite early. About 4 or something, but I learned to read before I really had proper comprehension. And I was reading one of my mother's magazines, and in it said, it was an ad for inner souls for people with very achy feet, and it said, like walking on air. And I got really excited because I read that to my mum. I said, Mum, I found flying shoes. It says like walking on air. And she goes, no, Mandy, they're not flying shoes. And I went, oh my God, how stupid are you, Mum? Like walking on air. What is like walking on air? Flying. Flying is like walking on air. I want these shoes. I insisted so much because to me, with my, coming from my truth, like walking on air was flying. My mother knew that it was completely different. But my perception of it was that they were flying shoes, and I thought she was an idiot. As it turned out, I got a pair of inner soles for Christmas, and that was a really good lesson in learning that there are many contexts within which we have. Thanks, Katrina. It's Katrina very nicely. It goes, enough, Mandy. She's calling me in, but I do actually have a little bit of time to fill before we bring Julian in, and I'd like to thank you for your very kind. I can see all your comments as they come through, so that's kind of how we go. The Bible, though, when we come to truth, is also another key place where, I guess that's where we were blooded on bizarre mythology, as which we have right now. Think of some of the stories that come through from the Bible, where so many fundamentalists, and when we move towards fundamentalist thinking, let us not forget where it's been seeded and how it has often been very much the enemy of good critical thinking. And has actually really kind of impact on our capacity for compassion, for logic. I was thinking of things like Lot's wife, for instance. Remember that story? The whole idea that if you looked behind you and saw what was going on, if you had retrospect, a whole story in the Bible that actually told you not to seek the truth, to stay with a very illogical, fundamentalist belief system. Otherwise, you would be turned into salt. That's a strong thing. I do remember Kathy Acker, a New York feminist writer from probably about the early 90s, wrote a rewrite of this story of Lot's wife, of which she was excavated and found as a very, very angry woman who deeply resented the whole idea of being buried alive for centuries for curiosity, which is in fact an innate human quality that we should not, in fact, be castigated or buried alive in salt for curiosity. Curiosity is very much an important part of the process. So I guess through religion, that is, the stories that we have grown up with. There's a whole lot more. The virgin birth itself is in itself an unbelievable expedition in fantasy writing. But these are things that very huge parts of our population believe to be true. In fact, we have a Prime Minister of this country who subscribes to an ideology which believes these stories very much to be true. and that the rapture is the end occurrence. You know, how can we put a government in charge of the well-being of an entire population when they believe that, in fact, a few of them will be the chosen ones to be taken up to the next level, wherever that is, and left behind? If that's not a conspiracy theory, I don't know what is. So that's a question I think we need to evaluate ourselves. Where does religion fit within that as a bizarre manifestations of other people's truths? I find that very, very strange. So I guess what we're talking is we are looking at, you know, tonight, and we are looking at the role of truth. And it is in an era of, I guess, of radical uncertainty. You know, I often struggle myself, you know, with things that we hear from time to time, because we are at a time where, you know, this sense of, there is no unified, you know, our world isn't unified. Things aren't neat. Stories don't tie in together. How do we live in a world where people believe QAnon, that the world lives with this, you know, the whole world's controlled, you know, by someone in a pizza parlor where they run pedophile rings underground? That becomes repeated so much, it becomes a certainty to a certain group of people. I call them cults without compounds. You know, you don't need a compound anymore to run a cult. You just need an ideology and a pretty good algorithm for sharing. So tonight, this is the conversation. I am your moderator and your comedian. I was just having a little warm-up chat there to get you ready. And if you would like to ask questions tonight, the way we do it through the webinar is you'll have your Q&A box. And I do think we have, you know, sort of, and I think we already have Ermila Sampson, who's actually put a fabulous question in there. Do put them there through the chat. I will be going through them. And after this, there will be about 40 minutes after we speak with Julian, where Julian gives his presentation, where I can put your questions forward. So do put them in through the evening. I'll try to work through as many as I can. So tonight it is, we are speaking with Julian Baggini. I'm not sure if I said your name right, Julian, but English philosopher, author of A Short History of Truth and Consolations for a Post-Truth World. He's also written books on atheism, secularism, and the nature of national identity. He's also a regular columnist for The Guardian, The Independent, The Observer, and the BBC. So without any further ado, please make Julian welcome.
Thanks very much, Mandy, Richard, everyone in the team, and thank you to everybody there. I'm going to share a screen with you in a minute, and so I've got some slides to look at, because you don't want to look at me for the whole time. That's far too much. So where do we begin? Let me get the screen up, and then we can not have to worry about concentrating on that. So I wrote a book called A Short History of Truth, which is not a history in the traditional sense of the word, not a linear history, but it's rather a kind of philosophical history. I'm sort of digging into the idea of truth, how it's manifested itself in the past. And I've had different ideas of truth. And the subtitle of the book was Consolations for a Post-Truth World, because certainly at the time the book came out, the phrase a post-truth world has perhaps not endured so much. People still talk about it. But there is this sense that we were living in this post-truth world, in the sense that there seemed to be a lot of people who didn't care about truth anymore. You remember that statement made by a high-level advisor to the American government during the Second Gulf War, in which he accused journalists of living in the reality-based community, and told off the journalists, saying that we create our own reality these days. We don't have to kind of be answerable to one that's already existing. And a lot of people found that quite shocking. Although, again, like many of these things, when you look at the full context of it, perhaps it makes a bit more sense than it looks at the beginning. But statements like that seem to suggest that respect for truth had been diminished. And we're having some kind of crisis of truth. And ever since, you know, my book was one of many, many, many attempts to try and make a bit more sense of that. But really what I want to do is, it's called Consolations for a post-truth world, because I think that this story is not an entirely negative one. And I think we can see with what's going on here, both signs of what the problems are, but also the signs of what the solution might be. And I think a good place to start with this is to recognize the positive, which is that there's a sense in which progress of various kinds have caused the crisis of truth. So in other words, if it weren't for the fact that over the longer arc of history, certain things have been going in very positive directions, we wouldn't have got this crisis of truth. Well, what do I mean by that? I'll give you various examples. Let's take science. Natural science, as we know it, is really only a few hundred years old. In terms of human civilization, it's very new. Of course, you can go back thousands of years. You've got people doing things which are sort of scientific, basing their conclusions on evidence and observation. And that's true also in all sorts of different kinds of communities and civilizations. It's not the case that simply what are thought of as the advanced industrial nations were the only people to ever do any kind of empirical thinking. But natural science as we know it today, with its experimental methods and the huge advances that really took place once those got going, is relatively new. Now, this has been great, of course. If you value truth, then science has been perhaps the most efficient truth-generating machine we've ever had in the whole of human history. But at the same time, it has generated a certain degree of confusion. Now, I don't mean that the scientists are confused. I'm saying that science itself sort of makes us confused because science is confusing. The late biologist Lewis Wolpert once wrote a book with the wonderful title, The Unnatural Nature of Science. And that book was really talking about all the ways in which what science tells us is contrary to common sense in almost every respect. So I'm getting some noise here. My cat has decided to wake up from its sleep in my favorite chair, hence and have a little cough. He's probably going to cough up a furball. I think he's all right. If you didn't hear that, and it was only me, I do apologize for the distraction, but it was very loud for a minute. So let's go back to the science about the unnatural nature of science. Science goes against common sense, things like gravity, for example, that the sun doesn't rise. It's actually, we're on an enormous globe which is rotating, and it's us that are moving. I mean, none of this makes sense from an intuitive point of view. And also, of course, science has got very, very complicated, very advanced. Science also creates uncertainty by its nature. One of the great strengths of science is that its findings are always provisional and testable. They're always up for revision. And often these things are. So science is very good at recognizing its own mistakes and building on them and getting to something a bit better. But this is extremely disorientating if you're not a scientist yourself. I'm not a scientist. And you can see how, how does one make sense of this? In the popular imagination, the conclusion people often draw is that scientists will tell you one thing 1 minute and one thing completely different the next. People who are old enough to remember the 1970s will remember scientists warning about a new ice age. And then what happens 20 years later, they're talking about global warming, what the earth is going on, all about nutritional science. A while back they were telling us that fat was the enemy, and now it turns out that a lot of fats are actually perfectly good for you and we should be eating them, and it's sugar and refined carbohydrates that are the problem, and then even that becomes old-fashioned. It becomes more about ultra processed food, etc. So science is this great system of thought we have for generating knowledge of the world, for generating truths, and yet it leaves people very, very confused and uncertain and unable to really determine what for them they should take to be true and what not true. Economics, if you move away from the hard sciences, the natural sciences, and the social sciences, you get a lot of problems here. And here it's not just about uncertainty, it's about straightforward error. The big financial crash 2008, I think, hugely embarrassed a lot of people in the economics profession. I say that there are lots of economists who would say that actually, they never claim that their discipline was able to predict with complete accuracy what would happen next and so forth, and that therefore economists have got a bit too much of a rap for it. But certainly there have been some big mistakes in economics. And, the confidence of a lot of economists was certainly shattered. In particular, those economic theorists who are most associated with what is often broadly and perhaps lazily called neoliberalism, the idea that you just need to liberalize markets as much as possible, and then bingo, everything sort of magically works. And that just turned out to be too wrong, I think. I think most people would agree with that now. Most people who would defend those market economics views would not defend a purely simplistic form of neoliberalism. So again, we have expertise in economics where you just see people making mistakes. So how can people trust that? We've also got broader social trends, globalization. Globalization comes in many forms. There's economic globalization, but there's also intellectual, social globalization. We live in a more interconnected world, and we've exchanged ideas and culture and music and theatre and novels with each other. And of course, what happens then is you very quickly discover that in different parts of the world and at different parts of history, people take very different views, sometimes on things that seem extremely fundamental. In Australia, for example, I wrote a book on global philosophy, and I didn't look in huge detail, but I spoke to someone who's an expert on Aboriginal thought systems, Aboriginal philosophies, and I've read around that. And we have different sort of notions of time and space. The way time and space work in these traditions is quite different from how it has traditionally worked in Western science. I say Western science simply from the point of view of that's where it originated. Of course, science isn't Western or Eastern, it's about the whole world. But it's not just Western science, it's more about Western culture, actually. And what's interesting there is that it turns out that in many ways, the indigenous Australian understanding of space and time has perhaps more in common with more recent physics than the traditional Western concept of time as this linear thing with a beginning and middle and end. Space and time seem to be more connected. It's a bit of an abstract example to give, perhaps, but you could also see around moral values, about valuing of community and family, more than individual rights and liberty in certain parts of the world, for example. And psychological experiments have also shown that the way people think at a quite profound level can be influenced by their culture. So there's some very famous experiments by a psychologist called Richard Nisbett, which asked people to sort of recall items on a little video they showed of a fish tank. And what they found was that people who had been brought up in Southeast Asian countries noticed far more changes to the background than people who've been grown up in an American context, where they notice more foreground items. What people are paying attention to at a very kind of intuitive level is affected by their culture and upbringing. So what lesson do people draw from this? Well, quite understandably, perhaps, it's that there is no such thing as the truth anymore. There are truths, and that these truths are determined by culture, history, maybe even geography, and not by anything more universal and fundamental. And if you believe that, it's little wonder then that you think the idea of truth itself becomes something somewhat weak. Then we've got in the media. The media were meant to be one of the great sources of truth. They fearlessly reported what was happening, stood up to power and vested interests. Now, I think the media, in lots of ways, still does that. There were some very courageous journalists, and I've been a bit disappointed to see some sort of like dismissive comments said about a journalist's role in Afghanistan in sort of repeating the lies of the authorities. Certainly that may be true of a lot of journalists, but there are also some very, say, courageous journalists on the ground there risking their lives to find things out. But in the public imagination, quite rightly because of various scandals in all sorts of parts of the world, have shown that the media certainly can't be trusted in any kind of straightforward way. And that depending on the publication, depending on the journalist, there is quite a lot of dishonesty or laziness and sometimes even corruption in the media. So again, what do people see? What conclusions do they draw? What they see is that the media isn't this kind of great bastion of the truth, the proud upholder of the way things are. The media is actually populated by people who are often untrustworthy, who are more interested in selling their newspapers or getting advertisers for their TV channels than they are of telling the truth. But again, I mean, going back over these previous things, I was saying this is all rooted in progress. Globalization is progress in the cultural sense. Understanding more and better how people think in different parts of the world expands our intellectual capacities, it expands our understanding. It is a good thing, but it has the consequence of, at the same time, challenging people's ideas of what truth is. The media, again, it's a good thing. A free press is the basis of a thriving democratic society in the proper sense of the word, world. And also, the more people become critical of it, the better. But with that realization that it's not perfect, that it can be corrupt, we get doubt. In an authority questioning as well, I mean, one of the great advances I would suggest of many parts of the world over history has been an increasing willingness and desire to question authority. You might even say this is a moral obligation to question authority. Immanuel Kant wrote in his famous essay, What is Enlightenment? That enlightenment was about a kind of a waking up, coming out of childishness, and to think, dare to think. We sometimes use that in the terms of think for yourself. And, you know, we don't think it's a sign of intellectual maturity simply to accept what authorities tell us. We think it's part of being an intelligent, critical thinker that you challenge authority. So this is a good thing, of course, but if we're challenging authority, this is a very difficult thing to get exactly right, because how do you challenge an authority when you don't have expertise on what that authority has expertise on? Do we challenging the authority of scientists is something I think people should do, partly because scientists sometimes use their scientific credentials to speak about things that they don't have any expertise on. If a scientist says we have no free will, a lot of people would say, well, that's a scientist saying we have no free will. You know, got to follow the science, don't we? But actually, whether or not we have free will isn't, I would argue, strictly a scientific question. You require a lot of philosophical understanding there. So there's a questioning of authority, good thing, but it leads to a kind of an atmosphere of skepticism and doubt. And of course, in psychology, perhaps this is one of the most uncomfortable things of all. You know, what has psychology really achieved in the last 50 odd years? Well, you might say it's told us and given us a huge long list of the myriad ways in which human thinking is flawed, subject to bias and distortion. Many people have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, so they know all about how actually a lot of the time we're not thinking in a logical, rigorous, systematic way. We're responding on an emotional level to what is going on, using quick and dirty shortcuts, essentially. We've been evolved for efficiency rather than truth. And, you know, we find that there's virtually nothing we can trust anymore about our own thinking. How can we trust our own thinking when we know we are subject to things like confirmation bias? And this is, of course, the phenomenon whereby if we believe something, then what we do is we spot all the evidence which supports that, and we end up discarding the evidence that doesn't, not as a conscious strategy, but just as something that we automatically do. Implicit bias, again, there's some controversy about how strong this is, but most people would agree that we do have these implicit biases, so that when we see people of certain, whatever it might be, whatever the cue is, it might be a haircut, it might be a way of dressing, it might be a skin color, it might be a perceived nationality. There's certain stereotypes kick in at a subjective level, and they affect the way we see people. We could go on. Could we do a whole talk on these? I could do 3 or 4 talks on these. But essentially, you know, the lesson that's drawn is that what psychology has told us is that we're not very good at critically thinking at all, and that we're driven by these emotional and unconscious biases. But of course, the irony here is that the fact that psychology has uncovered all these biases, these processes, shows that psychology has been very successful at exposing more of the truth about the way in which we think. So ironically, unless you thought psychology, you have to believe that psychology is very good at discovering and describing the truth about human thinking, and therefore that human minds are capable of understanding the truth about themselves in a way that hasn't been possible before, in order to get to the conclusion that actually you no longer trust the way we think at all. So there's a certain irony there. So I think if you put all these things together, I hope you can sort of see the case I'm trying to make here, which is that there are many ways in which our trust in experts, in our ability to know the truth, in even the possibility of there being a truth we can all agree on, has been undermined from various forces, all of which individually by themselves are actually signs of intellectual progress. And so there's a glimmer of hope just in that observation, because it suggests that what we might be experiencing could be more to do with a difficult phase in human development rather than anything terminal. I mean, when you're struggling to learn anything, there's often a period in learning where what's happened is that your old assumptions or what you thought you knew has been shaken up, and you haven't yet mastered what you're still learning. And you're left in that stage of transition in which you don't really know where you stand anymore. It's like you feel like you know nothing. But of course, you only feel like that because you've actually learned a hell of a lot. What you haven't done yet is come up with a clear way of understanding the broad picture, which puts it all together. So maybe there's some hope to be gained from that. Now, the other thing we want to say is we talk about the post-truth world, but actually I don't see any evidence at all that truth isn't valued. In fact, truth clearly is still valued. I've got a few pictures here. So here's some Trump supporters, and one of those signs, the Make America Great Again sign, has, I think, the QAnon logo there. So you've got people here who believe in these, I don't want to say crazy, because that's kind of pathologizing the people, but let's say completely baseless and irrational conspiracy theories about some kind of paedophile ring run out of some pizza basement in Washington. But that's not because they don't care about the truth. It's the opposite. It's because they care about the truth and they think this is the truth. Hence, you got the person there with the slogan, "Truth for Trump." Now, given how often Trump lied, or at least if not lied, deliberately lied, told things which are not true while president, that might seem extraordinary that someone says that. But I don't think we can just dismiss people as being insincere here. There is evidence here they care about truth. 9/11 truth, they're called truthers. The people who believe that the official narrative of what happened on 9/11 isn't the real one are absolutely concerned with the truth. In the UK, perhaps one of the examples I can give here is that when Tony Blair supported the Second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, he was, and it turned out that there weren't weapons of mass destruction. He was widely criticized, dismissed as a liar. I mean, he actually had this sort of horrible amalgam word, liar, sort of Blair and liar, squidged together. People thought there was something untrue there, and they cared about the truth. And this interesting headline from an independent news source, the Sovereign Independent, depopulation through forced vaccination. There's no mention of the word truth here, but clearly the whole idea of having a newspaper like this, which is very much focused on 9/11, is that people believe they are exposing the truth. It's not they don't care about the truth, they just think the truth isn't what's being presented. What's interesting about this, by the way, is that this, if you see the blow up, the fourth was June 2011, where it was suggested that there was some theory, some conspiracy to try and have depopulation through vaccination. And if you think about that, then along comes, if in 2019 you get a global pandemic and vaccinations being put through, this theory hasn't come out of nowhere. And in fact, the fact pointing to the fact that this conspiracy was reported way back in 2011 could seem to be very strong evidence, if you're that way inclined, that they've been waiting for the right opportunity forever. So truth I think is still valued. I don't think we can just sort of say people don't care about the truth. They still value the truth. But what is it? They don't trust the sources of truth that we used to have. And that's the point. What are the valid sources of truth? And people, I think, aren't clear enough about what they should trust as the sources of truth. And they're also taking the wrong ones. So what's happened here is that, first of all, in terms of the sources of truth, I think that because of the various forms of confusion I described earlier, that people don't feel, a lot of people don't feel able to trust scientists, trust the media, trust political leaders, trust what their culture has told them or their upbringing has told them. They feel that they have no trust. So what can you do? Now, if you can't work something out rationally, you go on your gut. And in a way, that can be a rational thing to do. It might sound a little bit strange to say that, but I think we can all imagine circumstances. So let's say you're trying to decide to buy whatever it might be. I don't know, you're trying to buy a new stereo system or something, if you still have such a thing. And you look it up and, you know, you see this one, you see that one, you weigh up the pros and cons. And there really doesn't seem to be anything based on the price or the specifications or the performance which is decisive. So what do you do in that situation? Well, just go with your gut, go with what you feel like. Okay, so we do use our gut as a way to make a decision when we feel that reason and evidence can't determine which way to go. That seems very, very rational. In fact, William James gave a philosophical argument that this was the legitimate reason for believing in God. He thought that in the case of belief in God, he believed, I don't agree with him, that the arguments are very finely balanced, that you can't really tell whether God exists or not. But he thought, nevertheless, you know, you've got to decide one way or another, and it's fairly momentous to your life which way you decide. So given that there was no way of settling it rationally, it was legitimate, philosophically legitimate, to go with your gut. So in a way, this kind of principle that gut should trump mind, as it were, has become a kind of implicit principle of how you determine what the truth is. And as we know, though, however, in the wrong circumstances, that's entirely the wrong thing to do. It is a legitimate thing to do where things are finely balanced in terms of evidence. But where the evidence and the arguments very strongly point in one direction rather than another, you definitely shouldn't be using your gut. And you certainly shouldn't be going to your gut first. It's the last resort arbiter. But because of the distrust and uncertainty and lack of faith in rational empirical methods to determine the truth has become widespread, gut becomes the default way of deciding. Okay, values trump facts. So again, I think this is very important for understanding something like Donald Trump. And I apologize for it because I'm using the verb trump here, not deliberately. In fact, I think that when I first wrote this book, I don't think Trump was president of the United States. So this turns out to be an unfortunate predictor. What do you mean by values trump facts? Well, again, if you don't really know what the facts are, or you don't trust anyone to give you the facts, then what's the best way to decide between the choices that you have in front of you? And well, one way to do that is to go on values. So again, let me give you a version of this which I think people can accept in their own case. If you vote in an election, a lot of people pride themselves on being well-informed voters. But I think most of us, if we're honest, are probably not half as well informed as we think we are. And if we go through the various policy areas and we say, how do you really know? You know, what really is your evidence that these are the most effective policies, right? Why do you believe that actually it will raise living standards to have high taxation, for example, rather than thinking that high taxation is going to stifle the economy and make things worse for everyone? You know, give me your economic theory for why that's so. Most people couldn't do it. And you can repeat that for most policy areas. But what people do is they don't actually make up their minds and they're voting on the basis of pure facts alone. The facts feed in, and as intelligent critical thinkers, we would hope to appeal to them as much as possible. But actually, a lot of the time, the way we ultimately decide is based on our values. Which of the parties, which of the people standing for election do we believe most firmly reflects our values? And we vote for them. because we think that's the way to get the best chance of the kind of world we want. And actually, because of that, we can give them a little bit of a easy ride on their own factual claims, because we know that in political campaigning, people can't just say what they think. They've got to think very carefully about how these things will go down. So we might accept the fact that you'd be foolish to be completely honest and completely rational in your forms of political campaigning, because you'll be taken to the cleaners by the other side. So we also know that people don't want to give support to the other side. So when we see people campaigning, even the people we support, we don't necessarily expect them to say the truth all the time. And we certainly can't know ourselves that we can fully establish that the things they say are true. But we go with values. Now, I think when we see politicians like Donald Trump successfully becoming president once and getting the second highest share of the president, the second highest number of votes of any president in history when he tried to get re-elected, you see him saying things which seem to be absurd, ridiculous, untrue. And you think, how on earth can it be that someone could vote for someone like that? Well, I think the answer is the same. People kind of don't expect him to tell the truth all the time, but what they see is that he stands for them. I find it strange they think that, but I sort of understand it. They think the choice is between an establishment led by a liberal Washington elite who have lost touch with ordinary people and don't really care about them. In fact, they think they're deplorables, as Hillary Clinton said. There's that lot against someone who is standing up for the ordinary American voter, the ordinary American citizen. So they go on the values. As a result, they have no problem at all just brushing aside all the crazy things he said. I think one of the biggest fallacies of Trump's success is that people believe that most people who voted for him would somehow believed everything he said. I think that the number of people who really believed Trump was probably a minority of the people who supported him. A lot of people knew he said a lot of crazy things. They didn't care. They thought we will have our guy in power standing up for us. So values trump facts. And of course, like the fact that gut trumps mind, that's kind of predictable and even arguably rational if you do not have any way of determining what the facts are. Authenticity trumps competence. This seems to be another issue as well. Because the very idea of competence is demolished. I mean, economists, psychologists, scientists in the public imagination, none of these people know what they're doing. There is no competence. So you don't trust experts. That's just ridiculous. And remember, it's a virtue of enlightenment, sort of post-enlightenment thinking, that you challenge your authority. So competence no longer becomes the key issue. What you can value instead is perceived authenticity. Is this person genuine? Are they sincere? And in that sense, that leads people to make, again, an emotional judgment rather than a purely rational one. Now, again, this doesn't completely explain everything from my point of view. So I don't really understand how people think Donald Trump is an authentic individual. And certainly in the UK, we have a Prime Minister called Boris Johnson, who I think is anything but authentic. But compared to the career politicians, both of these characters seem to be genuine in their own way. The fact they don't play by the rules, or perhaps they are, the very fact that they're bungling plays into the authenticity card, actually. A slick professional would not make the kind of gaffes that Trump or Johnson do. So the fact that they're a little bit kind of shambolic is a kind of sign of authenticity. Conspiracy trumps cock up as well. Well, this is a bit strange in a way, but when anything goes wrong, there's such distrust of authority and power that people are quite unwilling to accept the fact that simply a mistake has been made, and they think he said some kind of conspiracy is going on. This is actually connected to, I think, a fairly well-known sort of cognitive bias we all have, which is, we're reason-seeking people. Again, so this is actually rooted in something very positive. We think things don't happen for no reason. Everything must have a reason. The principle of sufficient reason goes back to sort of Leibniz, a 17th century philosopher. So again, it's very rational. It's actually very rational to believe that if something's happened, it has happened for a reason. But that reason seeking sort of goes a bit awry in this case, because a cock up just suggests the reason is just ordinary human incompetence, which is fine up to a point. But conspiracy is a more sort of powerful way of explaining things, because it explains things in terms of agency and choices and decisions. So I think we can see how that becomes attractive to people. And I think perhaps this brings together a few things. Partisan tribe trumps impartial expertise, because the idea of impartial expertise has basically become not debunked, but not trusted. That means that how do people really base their decisions? What do they base them on? Well, the tribe, right? Because it's not the experts versus the non-experts, because people don't trust that distinction. So rather in the sense that values trump facts, in the same way, your tribe trumps the other people you believe, because your tribe are the people whose values align with your own. And the most important thing is to align on the grounds of values than it is to align on the grounds of reason. And again, to be sympathetic to this, I think you see this happening in all sorts of circles. I sometimes call this like cluster thinking. At any given time, there's a general assumption that certain kind of beliefs go together. So, for example, environmentalism was for a long time thought to be naturally bundled with left-wing views. And as a result, what happens is that a lot of people on the right dismissed the science of climate change, or dismissed it because it didn't really seem to fit their worldview. It's part of the left worldview. And of course it isn't. Whether there's climate change or not is a scientific truth. It's a fact or it isn't. And your politics makes no difference to it. But psychologically, these things get bundled together. And this happens left and right as well. I mean, people who are, say, on the left liberal side of the spectrum, implicitly believe that that position entails certain other things, and certain things fit with that. And I do think one of the problems, without trying to sort of spark too much controversy, I think one reason why it's so difficult to have a civilized conversation about trans rights is that I think that a lot of people kind of assume that if you want to be on the side of trans people and equality, which I think I want to be on the side of that as well, then certain other views naturally go with it. And people who say, well, actually, that's not the case. I think that you can be both progressive, open, liberal, and in favor of trans people, and yet not accept certain statements as being true about what it means to be trans. These people cannot be heard because it doesn't fit the view of how the tribe is. So this kind of like partisan thinking, cluster thinking, is something which is not unique to people at the crazier end of the political spectrum. So where do we leave this with? So I've done something so far to try and explain a bit about what I think the sources of the problems are. And hopefully if I've been sort of like, 50% successful, then at least you can see some sense in which a lot of the reasons why people have lost trust in their ability to know the truth are very understandable ones, and are actually related to the advancement of science and reason and understanding and knowledge, and that people do care about the truth, but in the absence of any kind of belief that they can establish it through rational means, they're falling back on other ways of doing it, and this is part of the problem. So how do we put truth back into the picture more powerfully? Well, the broad approach I want to advocate for here is that, and I've reviewed a book or two recently actually about reason and rationality, and when people are trying to advocate for reason and rationality, what they'll often do is they'll explain to you how to make a valid deductive argument, how to make a good inductive argument, which is an argument from evidence of a scientific kind. They'll take you through forms of logical fallacy to avoid. They'll take you through various forms of psychological and cognitive bias that you have to be aware of. So it becomes kind of like a toolkit, sort of a mechanical toolkit for thinking properly. And so the idea here is that you need to teach people how to think. Essentially, it's a skill like any other, And it's a skill that can be taught, and there are methods, and that's it. Now, I'm not against that at all. I'm in favor of people knowing those skills. But actually, I don't think that's the most important thing. I think the most important things are attitudes and not theories. So there's something which has come to be called virtue epistemology. Epistemology is theory of knowledge, essentially. So it's about theorizing about knowledge. And virtue epistemology is the idea that, if you want to think well, if you want to know the truth, then what matters most are certain virtues, i.e. sort of good habits and good attitudes around thinking, more than a particular kind of theory of what truth is and so forth. I don't think anyone needs a theory of what truth is. In fact, theories of truth have been very disappointing in philosophy. I mean, for a long time, one of the most dominant theories of truth was called the correspondence theory of truth. And it says that, like, the statement, all the textbooks would use the same example. The statement "snow is white," in inverted commas, is true if and only if snow is actually right. I mean, there are reasons why people have this theory and why it's not completely empty, but it kind of is almost empty. It's almost like tautological. It's not really getting you anywhere. I don't think people have any problem with their theoretical understanding of truth. An everyday common sense notion of truth, namely that something is true if it accurately describes the way things are or have been. You don't need anything more than that. The reason why people are disagreeing about truth is not generally because they've got the wrong theories. Attitudes are more important. And what are the right attitudes to have? Well, I'm going to go back here to a philosopher called Bernard Williams, who wrote a book called Truth and Truthfulness. It was his last book. And he talked about two key virtues. And the first one is sincerity. We've got to be sincere, meaning not just about being honest in opening up our hearts. We've got to sincerely desire the truth. We've got to sincerely want the truth. When we say that we think this is true, it's got to reflect a sincere desire to know what the truth is, not just a kind of a wishful thinking or something that's convenient for us. So we need absolute sincerity in this. And this is something, again, that everyone has to think about, no matter where you are on this debate. So it's very, you can turn around to point to like QAnon theorists and say, you're not being sincere. Well, in some ways, they are being entirely sincere, right? They have a passionate belief in this, have a desire in this. But the lack of sincerity here is, look, if you are sincere in your pursuit of truth, then you have a kind of an obligation to be thorough and to be careful, to challenge your own beliefs, to check your facts more carefully and so forth. So by sincerity, we don't just mean a kind of a spontaneous sort of like, feeling of expressing oneself in an honest way. It's a sincere desire to want to know what the truth is. And it sounds almost like a platitudinous virtue. It sounds something like we would all have, but I don't think we do all have it, because actually a lot of the time we slip into ways of thinking where the sincere pursuit of truth becomes secondary to the desire to sort of uphold what we already believe, because sincerity can lead to discomfort. If you're sincerely interested in the truth and someone challenges it in a way, the easiest thing is to just bash it away, dismiss them. The more difficult thing is to take it seriously. The second one is accuracy. It's simply getting your facts right, being precise. And again, I find this astonishing, because accuracy is something you very rarely see on all parts of the political spectrum. I do use social media to a certain extent, and I'm often disappointed and staggered to see people reposting things which actually have no factual basis, which if you spent 2 minutes checking their sources, you would recognize they weren't accurate. People repeat them because they confirm their own worldviews. Sincerity and accuracy together. I mean, just imagine, forget any theory of truth, just imagine that we all pursued the question of the truthfulness of anything on the basis of those two virtues, sincerity and accuracy. It's not magic. Nothing works completely by itself, but you'd go a heck of a long way. I don't think you could, for example, deny human-made climate change if you looked at that issue with a combination of desire for accuracy and a sincere inquiry. I mean, you might not, you wouldn't end up with certainty. And this is the other thing, which I think is a really important thing, is that dealing with lack of certainty is something that people find very, very difficult. People prefer certainty. Lack of certainty is a fact of life. It is not certain that we're living through an age of human-made climate change. I think that should be acknowledged. It is not certain. It is possible something else is going on. But the evidence is so strong that it is human-made, that it would be crazy to act at the moment on any other basis. So sincerity can actually take you a long way. I think there are other virtues as well. I think modesty is one. Particularly, we see this in terms of like the aggressiveness of a lot of debates now. People we disagree with are not just kind of wrong, they're kind of evil. It's so often the way. Now, this becomes much less possible if you are genuinely modest in your beliefs, right? In other words, if you accept the fact that when it comes to most things, one cannot have certainty, so that therefore one has to be open to being wrong. That's what modesty really means. And it connects to things that others as well. I'll come to another one in a minute. Skepticism, not cynicism. There's a fine line here. One has to be skeptical, critical, of course. But if skepticism goes too far, or if skepticism is just sort of like let off the reins, it becomes cynicism, which you don't believe anybody. And I think, again, going back to what I was saying before, the idea that we should question authority, we should question the dominant narratives is a good thing. We should be doing it. But doing that with an appropriate skepticism is quite difficult and time consuming and cognitively effortful. And so it's very easy instead just to lapse into a cynicism where you just don't believe anyone or anything. Cynicism is corrosive, skepticism is not. We need it. Openness, this really relates to modesty. It's being open to new information and not being afraid of it. I think sometimes we really sort of like, we make assumptions. Again, if you that's what's about the cluster thinking. We think that having one view means we must have a whole load of other views. So that if any one of those views is challenged, we kind of want to resist it. I think you should be less scared of that, because first of all, if it's true that that is false and it brings down all the other beliefs like a stack of cards, then we should still have the courage to be able to go through with that, to be open to it. But actually, often we have less to fear from this than we might think. A lot of the time, what happens is that accepting that one thing we believed isn't actually true doesn't necessarily bring the rest of the things tumbling down at all. So I think being open is, of course, extremely important. And collectivity, and one of the problems we have is that we don't actually think very well by ourselves in rooms. Not naturally, most of us don't anyway. A few people do. There's a theory of social cognition which has been put forward recently. The most prominent advocates have been Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier, whose book The Enigma of Reason is excellent on this. And they show that actually human rationality, for all this stuff that science has showed we're not very rational, when we reason together with other people, we're actually often very, very good. So these exercises in deliberative democracy have kind of shown this. If you just get a group of random citizens and you put them together in a room or in a virtual webinar room, and you give them the evidence, they tend to reach very, very sensible and intelligent conclusions. So I think that kind of collectivity is important, but it's a genuine collectivity. It's not this sort of closed collectivity of like a cult or, the in-group, the tribe, where you're only listening to people from your own group. For the collectivity of thinking to work, it has to be an open collectivity in which you hear lots of different voices. And it also, we have to remember that we have to speak truth to power and not see truth as power. Because I think one of the unfortunate theoretical hangovers of continental European philosophy is Foucault had this idea of truth as power, which has a lot of sense to it. And I think what he really meant was not that truth is power, although he said things which made it sound like that at times, but rather what gets accepted as truth or what gets promoted as truth is normally just a tool of power. So in other words, who controls Whoever controls what gets to be accepted as truth has power. Now, that is true. I don't think we should deny that. But it doesn't mean that there is no such thing as truth, and truth simply is power. In fact, in order to challenge those people who get to control what's held as truth and to replace it by what really is true, you have to believe there is something which really is true. So we have to have that as well. And finally, creative truth and not with truth. This is something which I talk about. I talk about creative truth, and you might say that sounds a bit like a euphemism for lying. We shouldn't be creative with the truth in the sense of like you're bending it and distorting it. But one thing we've got to remember is that a lot of the most important truths in the world are not just brute facts. They're things that are a result of our agency. And I think that perhaps the emphasis on scientific truth as the discovery of things out there, quite correctly, has kind of hidden this aspect of truth. We are making truths all the time. Going back to that advisor to Bush, who said that we make our own reality these days. That wasn't just hubris. That is kind of true. That is true. So, for example, you know, how much child poverty is there in the world? Well, that's a truth. The answer to that is a truth, but the truth of that is almost entirely dependent upon decisions we make politically and as a society. Is it true that we're going to reach unsustainable levels of global warming? It's true that it is true if we don't do anything about it. It's not true if we do something about it. So I think, you know, we've got to remember that having a sort of robust notion of truth is not about sort of bowing down in front of the unchangeable and objective all the time. In fact, you know, it's very important we recognize that there are a lot of truths about the world, a lot of really important world truths about, particularly about society and ethics, for us to create, and we decide whether they get created or not. I think I better stop because we've been going on far too long. I just wanted to briefly say this about how, in terms of politics, the possibility of truth in politics might seem a thin one, because nowadays everyone seems compelled to use the tools of communication and advertising, which is all about manipulation and not really about truth. I think it is possible to have communication without spin, and I'll just point you to Aristotle's theory of rhetoric to kind of the source of this. Aristotle believed that there were three things which make for effective speech: pathos, logos, and ethos, which is emotion, reason, and character. All these three things together. What's happened is, I think that a lot of public speaking, public communication has become all about manipulating the emotions. It's all about the pathos. And it should have those other two aspects as well. It needs to be backed by reason, but also it has to be backed by the trust in the character. The character of the speaker has to be something people back. Now, I believe my optimistic thing here is that I can think of some recent political leaders who have exhibited all these three characters, and they are popular. Barack Obama, loads of people hated him, but in fact his approval ratings were really high. He was re-elected, and he had some of the most highest ratings of all time. And Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, across the Tasman Sea from you. I think these are examples of leaders who do this. They emotionally connect with people, but they offer reasons for the argument, and they're seen as people of great character. And that's the kind of leadership we need. And I think sometimes people try and fight fire with fire. They see the sort of like the spin doctors, the populist rabble rousers, and they think the only way to defeat them is to fight on their own terms. Whereas I think that actually we've got good evidence to see that we can have a more truthful politics in that way. We need to play the long game. Trust needs to be rebuilt. Complexity needs to be embraced. Democracy needs to be reformed. But I'm just throwing those at you because I'm aware of the fact that I've gone on for a very, very long time, and it's about time we had some questions and so forth. So thank you very, very much for bearing with me for this rather long talk. And I'm aware that also a lot of things would probably have been a bit, what can we say? Although I've spoken for a long time, there's a lot there, and there's a lot we haven't had time to go into in great detail. So hopefully in the questions and answers, we can get into more of the nitty-gritty and complexities.
Thank you so much, Julian, for that. We do have some questions, and if anyone else has questions, do pop them in. It was actually, when you're talking about political spin, it was interesting. Gladys Berejiklian, who's the New South Wales Premier, who's been doing, or until recently, a press conference every night about COVID. I saw her once. I've watched everyone, and it's all on spin. Until one night she just went, "I don't know. Nobody knows." It was that was the most compelling answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is, but people are afraid of that. I do find that the politicians are afraid of this. And I think, again, I have to be sympathetic with some reason. I think you can give examples of where people have tried to be straight with the electorate and being honest. And sometimes people really don't like what they're being told when they're being straight and being honest. In a crisis, for example, you know, in a crisis, people want to believe things are under control. You know, no one wants people.
Yeah, well, that is.
Imagine.
Yeah,
imagine, like, you know, 5 minutes after 9/11, George Bush had a press conference. So I've just heard about this stuff. I don't know what the fuck's going on here. We're working on it, but shit, you know, people don't want to hear that.
No,
they want
don't.
someone saying, our intelligence agencies are on this case. We've got answered. We will be avenged. You know, we will get justice, etc. You know? So yeah. It's a tough sell. But I think in the long run, but it goes back to the character thing. You see, I think that people will only buy these kind of messages from people they have learned that they can trust and are trustworthy. Of course, they don't accept it from someone who, up until that point, has been just sort of telling them what they want to hear. You know. In the UK, sorry, I want to go this bit. In the UK, I'll be honest with you, cards on the table. I think our government has handled the whole COVID thing in a completely catastrophic way, and Boris Johnson is the worst prime minister in living memory. Right, his finest moment in this crisis was when he gave a press conference at the beginning, and he said something like, you know, we're going to lose too many people, too many loved ones will die. He was honest about that. It's going to happen, and that was the only time in this whole crisis where people have said, you know, they've gone, well done, Boris. You said what needed to be said. The rest has been fiasco.
Yeah, well, it's clear it was what you remember. I'll go to the thank you for that. What the questions? The first one that come up tonight is actually from Urmila Sampson, and she asks, do you think the school system needs to change completely from content-centered to doing, thinking, feeling, being, and centered around the unique individuality of each child? So I guess changing the way we educate kids to change the kind of thinkers we create.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And, you know, going back to one of the intellectual virtues of modesty, one has to accept the fact that, you know, everyone thinks they're an expert on education. But of course, actually, you know, it's not like that. I can't tell you, I can't pretend to know what the best system is. I think that one's going to be, what happens with, what I would suggest happens with education, though, is that, again, where education sort of tends to go wrong is when people get too carried away, too devoted to a kind of a principle of education which they believe has worked. So, I mean, child-centered learning has been a phrase we've used for a long time, and of course, it should be completely unobjectionable. Of course, it should be sort of child-centered, but people have often believed that involves certain other things, which I don't think necessarily does involve, such as maybe never testing or never making the child uncomfortable in a way, whereas sometimes you have to kind of push. So, and also I think the idea of tailoring it to every individual, it sounds good, but I don't think that it's probably not practical unless you go down the route of using a hell of a lot of AI. And I think the problem with all of this is that one of the most important aspects of education should be the social aspect. Okay, education is where we learn that other people are different to us, that we learn at different paces, that we have different values, etc. So I think that if you make education too individually focused, you're compounding a deeper problem in our society, which is excessive individualization and not enough sense of community. So in terms of, like, you know, less on content, again, content is important, and I get frustrated as someone who's trying to still learn as an adult that Lots of documentaries these days the substance to style ratios in documentaries has got askew, I think. And I sometimes watch a whole hour documentary thinking, look, they could have told me that in 20 minutes, but instead I have to have the shot of the presenter's emotional moment.
You don't need that. Yeah, individualism seems to have skewed like this sense of constantly placing ourselves at the center
Yes.
is such an incredible way of losing sight of what the truth is. It feels like half the time, because we individualize it, we personalize it,
Yeah.
and therefore it loses its bigger frame. It's less general because it's just mine.
I agree. So I think one's got to be wary of these things. So I mean, I think that I can tell I'm sympathetic to various undercurrents in the question there. I think we should be careful about making it too individualistic, and we should be careful about depriving people of important content, because that's really, really important. But I think we do think you have to think about what kind of characters our schools are creating. And I think that in the UK, I can't speak for Australia, in the UK, it's really sort of been very good at getting young people who are just extremely anxious and stressed about their futures and competition with each other. And it hasn't been so good about generating people who are sort of just curious and interested in that way.
I might move on to another one. This is Arthur Burrows has had quite a few fantastic questions here in the chat. One of them says, each of your chapter headings in A Brief History of Truth, authoritative truths, holistic truths, etc., contain a qualifier of the word truth. Can you offer a working definition for this overworked word? What do we mean by, in inverted commas, a truth?
Yeah, well, I think I'd go back to what I was saying in the talk when I was saying that the theories of truth, and a lot of people, in philosophy, obviously one thinks one needs a theory, and also one needs a definition. Define your terms is one of the clearest things. And I just think it's been really disappointing. I think and I do stab at what I said there, which is that I don't think that's what we're lacking. I say something is true, if it is the case. I mean, you end up saying something that sounds like a tautology. It just sounds like a way of saying the same thing in a different ways. Something is true if it is the case. And I guess if you want to expand on that, I think importantly, if it is the case, independently of my own sort of wills and desire and whatever else it might be, so something which is true for me is kind of a contradiction in terms. I mean, true for me means I believe it's true, but it doesn't mean it is, right? So there's no such thing as true for me. The true for me means it seems true for me. And again, true for you is the same way. So it's something that is the case, irrespective whether we like it or not, in a sense. And I think it's that point that the only key thing we have to kind of remember when we're talking about truth is that is that it's something which kind of we are answerable to, and not the other way around, right? The moment we start thinking that truth is something that we can sort of will or desire in and out of existence, that's where we're in trouble. So I'm not actually being evasive by seeking to avoid giving a strong definition. I think it's kind of unhelpful. I mean, no one in practical life, no one has a problem with this. If you go to court, I don't know what the oath is in Australia, but we say, promises to say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God, whatever it might be. And everyone knows what that means. And people's complex theories of truths quickly evaporate in real life. You lied to me, you cheated on me, you said you were fishing with your mates and you're out with your lover. I mean, everyone knows what's the difference between true and false there. It'd be you could do a comedy routine, you probably have done already, about someone who is sort of like is found to have just told a blatant lie and answers it by giving some complex theory of truth. It says, "Oh no, I didn't lie. I simply presented a legitimately alternative perspective on non-objective reality." Everyone knows that's bullshit. They don't need a theory to tell them that.
I've got a question too from Dale Emerson. It says the role of religion. It's a bit of a long one, but bear with me. The role of religion has been disparaged. So, what do you think of the following faith-based statement coming from the Baha'i faith, where there is a counsel for the individual to avoid dogmatic and blind imitation. Does this fit into your ideas of how to put truth back? There is a quote. Do you want me to read you the quote?
Yeah, how long is it? Okay, well, let's try it.
I'll act it out. No, I won't. God has created in man the power of reason whereby man is enabled to investigate reality. It's already lost me because it's saying man. God has not intended man to blindly imitate his fathers and ancestors. He's endowed him with the mind or the faculty of reasoning by the exercise of which he is to investigate and discover the truth. And that which he finds real and true, he must accept. It goes on for that about not being an imitator.
Okay.
But I think you get the gist.
Yeah, I get the gist. I mean, yeah, I mean, you said some, you took a few little swipes at certain forms of religion at the beginning. I think it's really important to, I think it's really important to recognise that religion is multifarious, right? It comes in very, very many different forms, and we've had bishops and archbishops in the Church of England who don't really believe in God in a way that the average person on the pew would. How do we interpret these phrases? That quote there, God has created, man, humanity. People can understand that in many, many different ways, because as some people say, God created means nothing, something quite general about, some kind of ultimate power. They don't have any other idea what that is other than that. It's just a word that we use for that. I think that the thing about religion is that it's not inherent. I don't think it is inherently religion is almost invariably concerned with truth, right? I mean, people have a desire for the truth.
But would you say that they have a desire? But would you say, sorry for interrupting while you're on that though, is religion, and I'm talking about fundamentalists, not religion, but is it inherently an obstruction to truth? Because it is often about a more absolute idea.
Yeah. When it's dogmatic and when it's fundamentalist in those terms, it is. Well, that's the same with any kind of belief system, and it's not unique with that. So, like fundamentalist or Maoism or Stalinism is also, and also, I mean, I think you can have. I don't think it's very common, but I think there can be a fundamentalist kind of atheism and humanism too, where people just sort of fully believing they're on the side of reason and truth and everything, actually are so wedded to their view that they don't have that openness. And I think that's the point. It's about the openness and inquiry. Now, but not all religion is like that. And even in Islam, for example, there are plenty of scholars who point to certain Quranic verses which are very actually sound rather like that Baha'i statement, which is that God gave humanity reason, and it was kind of our divine duty to use it, and we should have no problem with exploring it. So the falsafas, which is a group of Islamic sort of philosophers around the sort of the Middle Ages, were very much of this kind of view, that it wasn't heresy to use reason. In fact, God commanded us to do it. So I think that there's always a danger with religion, and there's often a tendency for it to obstruct truth because it shuts down certain lines of inquiry and asserts certain things to be true by fiat and by declaration, and that makes it antithetical to reason. But I know from various exchanges and dialogues with other sort of religious people that's not necessarily the case. So I do think it's quite unhelpful if sort of secularists like myself aren't a bit careless and sort of talk of religion and the harms of religion in a way which encompasses all forms of religion. I think it's very alienating for those very sincere and intelligent, truth-seeking people who are religious, who are not dogmatic, and it doesn't help.
Yeah.
So I'm in favour of what I call the coalition of the reasonable, right? So I'm not. There are reasonable people within and outside of religion, and our common cause should be trying to promote good critical thinking, and that unites us more than the things that divide us.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I like that men got God gave men reason and women got rage. When we missed out on reason in that one. I've got a question from Anne Coombs. She says, in your opening, Julian, you where you listed science, economics, etc. You didn't list philosophy. Don't you think the 1980s, 90s postmodernism, which posited that there was no single truth, but only a multiple truths, depending on where you were standing, perhaps was the beginning of the post-truth world? That was what I was grappling with when I was at uni, was going through the multiplicity of truths.
Yeah.
That was a
No, I didn't.
period.
I didn't list it. I think perhaps because I felt that people tend to overestimate the impact of what they're interested in on the wider society, and perhaps I'm skeptical that these things really work through. But in a way, they clearly did. I think there was a certain responsibility there. When you look at the people in sort of academia who promoted these kind of theories, and most of them weren't postmodernists. Actually, it's a word that people use to sort of cover them all. But Derrida was not a postmodernist; he was post-structuralist, whatever it was. But I do think these things do have a tendency to sort of filter out into wider society, sometimes in a bastardized form or watered down form. And I do think there is some responsibility there to accept that. And it's not just about philosophy, actually. In some ways, these theories are even more common in other sort of social sciences and humanities. In English-speaking philosophy, actually never really went for this kind of stuff at all. Not much. So I think there is, but I think that. So, for example, if I just one example of this, there's Jean-Francois Lyotard wrote a little book called The Postmodern Condition. If you actually read it today, it is not a kind of manifesto for there is no truth, let it all hang out. It's actually partly a point of almost sociology. He's describing what's actually going on in the world in terms of how, claims to truth and knowledge are controlled. It's about, how knowledge, in inverted commas, is managed by the powerful to suit their means and so forth. And it only really makes sense if there is something true underneath it all. So, but I do agree. I think the broader culture kind of learned. I know a lot of people, the philosophy lecturers, say that their new students turn up and they kind of just assume on day one. Well, of course, there's no truth, is there? And they have to get it bashed out of them by the philosophers rather than the other way around. So I do agree, and I think we're still seeing issues around that. For example. Again, I did allude to the trans debate, but I mean, a lot of that kind of early theorizing is still infecting that because the idea that all scientific categories are social constructions, essentially. So the idea here is that male and female are not sort of like objective terms in biology. They're actually social constructions. Now, I think this is really unhelpful because, I mean, again, I like to stress the fact that I want to live in a world in which every trans person can live with the same rights and liberties and as anybody else and face no discrimination whatsoever. But I don't think it helps in the long run on that debate if someone comes in with a theory which says that biological sex is not just irrelevant. You can argue it's irrelevant, but it doesn't exist. Then I don't see how you can get anywhere with that.
Yeah. Okay. Rachel Trevathan has asked, what do you think, and this is very current, reflecting back to the information at the moment, looking, I guess, at the information/misinformation, is what do you think is the reason for the large amount of information that seems intent to scare people off vaccines? Is there truth to some of the claims? I've been around people who refused to hug me when I got vaccinated because they were scared that I might shed on them. Where is the information coming from and what is driving it? And I guess at the moment, Julian, this is true, particularly, very much in our community, where we are naturally suspicious of authority. We naturally question. We have a long history of being very engaged in wellness, opposed from away from pharmaceutical companies. So when you couple that with a government that has been very poor at delivering information, we end up with quite a volatile conversation, or not even a conversation. It goes from, how do we, what this is the big space that we're all in at the moment, trying to find the truth, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's what we're becoming quite adversarial about, because we're all holding our patch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, this is just a sideways way into this. I recently conducted a small, not really a proper sort of proto study with another guy who sort of had the basic idea for it, which we took two groups of people and with some of them we asked this question first of all. Imagine that the only vaccine available were one which came from a country whose government you do not trust. Would you take it? Right? And a lot of people will say, well, no. You know, we were going to say China or something. We wanted people to choose their own. But imagine a country who you have a very, very low degrees of trust in. That's the only vaccine going. Would you take it? And a lot of people would say no, and it's understandable. And I think that, again, so a lot of people I know, I've been double jabbed. I've had my vaccinations. I know I certainly would have felt nervous about this Sputnik jab or even the Chinese one. I would have felt nervous about that because I don't have high degrees of trust in the governments there. And then we asked them the question, imagine how understandable do you think it is that members of communities who have historical reasons for not trusting our government are not trustful of the vaccine, right?
Yeah.
And we asked that same question to people without the first question, right? Without the first question to prime them. And it dramatically, quite largely changed people's responses. In other words, putting yourself in the shoes of imagining a situation where you would be distrustful makes it much easier to understand why certain groups would be. I mean, the thing is, because the history isn't being made up. There are actual events of, in America, for example, you know, people of color being effectively used in medical experiments by the government. It has happened, right? Now, I think you have, so I think you've got to start by trying to understand where it's coming from and not just see it as purely a manifestation of insanity. And I think that those high levels of distrust just go really deep. And the other thing to add is a bit of psychology rather than philosophy, of course. There is something, it's very easy to feel a kind of a primitive kind of disgust at something, a foreign body entering your body. It's not something that is natural. Actually, anything outside of oneself, you know this famous psychology experiment whereby you ask people to spit into a cup and then drink it. Most people find that disgusting. But if you think about it, why is it disgusting? You've only putting back into your mouth what was there in the first place. But this whole point about, you know, things entering your body.
Create.
So there are natural kind of elements of disgust. There is also an understandable suspicion about the fallibility of science and everything. And then there's also a distrust of authorities who, after all, have done things. And I think that makes it all very understandable. Now, I think the problem is that when you put that all together, when you ask people specifically, you know, why won't you hug me? What they come out with just sounds ridiculous. You know, what that is a deliberately infected, or there's a little microchip in the vaccine which is going to control our brains. You know, they can't even. The most powerful nation in the world can't even win a war in Afghanistan against a poorly equipped ragbag, right? But it has the power somehow to control us all with microchips in our blood.
But not just that, but the unified nature, this belief that that seems to be almost more fantastical than a belief in God, is a belief that humans can be so unified across in creating this one unified truth.
Yeah, but I think the point is that, again, so you can see how in terms of this conversation we've kind of flipped from it being very understandable why people are distrustful of authority, etc., 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 and then but the specific things they say seem to be crazy and bonkers, and how can you possibly believe that? And again, going back to Hugo Mercier chap, he came up with this idea. I don't know, it wasn't his idea originally, actually, but there's an idea around in psychology, which is that actually when we say we believe things, there was it's not so much two things, there's like a spectrum, but let's say two for simplicity. There are certain things we believe, and we believe them to be true in ways that intuitively powerful, right? So I believe that this desk is hard, which means I'm not going to bash my head against it, right? I believe that knife is cut, not going to do it. So there are those kind of beliefs where the relationship between the belief and how we act in the world is very, very tight. And we have a load of other beliefs where actually it's kind of not like that. So he uses the example of the person who, the QAnon theorist who leaves a bad TripAdvisor review for that pizzeria in Washington. Now he's saying this, if you really, really, really believe there's a paedophile ring in there, actually you would do what only one person has done, which was went in there with all guns blazing, right? It was a gunman went in there. But if you genuinely believe there's a paedophile ring under there, then probably a lot of people would do that kind of vigilantism. So what's going on is that you wouldn't leave a bad review on TripAdvisor, right? So what he's saying is that there are a whole lots of beliefs which it's quite complicated. We sincerely believe we believe them, but we're clearly not acting as though we believe them in that way. And the vaccine things is a little bit complicated because people are making decisions on the basis of that. So they are acting as though they are true, but they're not really acting as though the whole theory is true, right? And I think it's important. So that's the important thing to sort of recognize. It's a bit uncomfortable. It means that when we say things are true and that we believe things, even sincerely, it doesn't. We hold those beliefs in rather peculiar ways sometimes, and that makes it that's got to be the beginning of understanding why it is that people can believe things which seem completely ridiculous. It's because they're holding that belief in a rather peculiar way, but a very natural way, it turns out, in which it's not truly informing their entire worldview. It's a bit compartmentalized, in other words, Yeah. And the function of those beliefs is more to kind of stand as a kind of an indicator of something else, which is distrust of authority, loss of faith in science, desire to challenge the orthodoxy, and the fear of contamination as well, which is very, very strong.
I want to finish with one final question because it's following on from the COVID, and it's from Rosie in Queensland. And she says, how can true for me, in quotation marks, possibly apply when you're a nurse working in a big city hospital looking after the unvaccinated COVID numbers currently and watching, people who are unwell and, experiencing a direct experience of death? I wonder,
The first is how can you give me the first part of that question?
I think what she's asking is about the true for me when she's in relation to the sense of what is true for me. And I guess when you're looking at the experience of someone who's a frontline worker, whose sense of truth, someone else's true for me, which is maybe me living in this community where there is currently no experience of that, but a frontline worker whose true for me is horrendous and traumatizing. How does that, like she's saying, how does that impact on truth? Like, how can there be a truth for me? Because clearly there is an experience that is much larger and realer, I guess.
Yeah.
Is there?
Well, I mean, okay. Well, let's try and get a grip on this. I think the point is that there's, when we're sort of being good critical thinkers, we have to put various things together, right? And one is our personal experience, right? Sometimes our personal experience is very, very strong and important evidence, right? Sometimes it isn't, and you've got to learn when it is and when it isn't. So, for example, when someone says, "Well, I don't see anyone with COVID, therefore it doesn't exist," that's you can show that's a fallacious argument, right? Someone who says, "I'm in a hospital and I'm dealing with COVID patients every day," that shows that it exists. It doesn't actually, even then, it doesn't by itself show the severity of it. So, if imagine, for example, that all the COVID patients in Australia were being treated in one hospital, which was underfunded. The experience of the frontline worker would be, we're completely overwhelmed by COVID, but that's only because you haven't got the resources, not enough people. So you've always got to kind of put those things together. Yeah. I think in this case, if you are a frontline worker, and I don't know if the question is that, if you are a frontline worker and you're seeing this, it's not just you seeing it, you've got colleagues as well. So there's a collective element to this. It's not just true for me, right? It's not just your perception. There are other people confirming that. how do you deal with the people who sort of like stand there and sort of insist that it's true for them, that as far as they're concerned, it's all being made up, it's minor and everything? But in a way, I think that's a question perhaps which is more about how do you cope with that emotionally and psychologically? Because, you know, it's upsetting apart from anything else, isn't it? And it's kind of somebody denying an important truth about how tough your life is at the moment and how much suffering you're dealing with and all that kind of thing. So I guess I'm not a therapist, and I don't know how best to advise that. I think in general, though, hard though it may be, I think we should always try, if we can, to try and understand where people are coming from, what's motivating their thinking, even when it's completely wrong and even when it's crazy. There is sometimes a time for anger and indignation as well, you know? I mean, there is this notion of like political anger or whatever it's called. You know, sometimes in order to achieve change, you need someone, I don't know, the Greta Thunberg thing, sort of, you know, getting across at the United Nations, you know. If you just played the role of the polite little girl saying, I would like you to help the children of the world so we can build a better future, it would have been easy. A bit of anger was kind of needed. But even when we're angry, you know, we need to take a deep breath and try to understand. But I think that must be really upsetting. I think this is one of the most unfortunate things about this whole situation, is that there are people who have lost people, who have been struggling to keep people alive, who have risked things and everything, being told this is all a load of nonsense by people, and that's so belittling. But in that case, you also perhaps take heart from the fact that for every person like that, I think there are many more who are just profoundly grateful to people like that doing that work, and humbly appreciative.
Thank you so much, Julian. It's incredibly important having these conversations too, because you know, we are at a time where we're trying to understand, you know, the positions, the ideas, you know, of others. We're trying to decipher information from the media. You know, what we believe, what our sources are. We are, you know, trying to be rigorous, I guess, on social media. There's so much information crossing our paths every day. And so many of us, and myself particularly included, I would have to say, we are, you know, very often so prone to bias, and to that whole idea of always looking for confirmation bias. I love what you said about the sincerity, about being someone that actually doesn't just seek to confirm, but is open to actually information which often may not confirm what you believe. So thank you very much for speaking with us this evening, Julian, on Critical Conversations, on the aspects this evening, on the very tricky nature of truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone having me.
And I hope everyone can join in too with Critical Conversations with their next upcoming event. Do check out their Facebook page and register for that event. That will be a live event too at this point, where we're able to gather live. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a really nice evening. And we all attended this tonight, and I believe that is true.